And there we are. Now we're official. Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Coffee Talks. I'm really excited today to have Emily with us. Emily Kroc is with the Aly Sterling Philanthropy Group. And Emily, I'm going to let you do some of your own introduction. But I think that all of you are aware of our longstanding relationship with Aly Sterling Philanthropy. It actually started probably about 10 or 11 years ago when Aly and I met kind of more on a friendship basis. She's good friends with a friend of mine, or she's cousins with a good friend of mine. And we just connected and have just really enjoyed the relationship that we have with Aly Sterling Philanthropy and all of the great programming and insight and professionalism that she brings to nonprofit management. So today we're going to be talking about board relationships, I think is really kind of where Emily and I kind of settled on. And I hope that this is an engaging conversation. I told Emily we like to keep these casual. So if you have a question, your microphones are open. You don't have to ask permission or do anything formal to raise your hand. If you're more comfortable raising your hand and want me to call on you and do that, if you have a question, feel free to do that. And also, if you would rather us read your question in the chat, Liz from our office is also here to help us monitor the chat feature as well. Whatever you're comfortable with. Again, we want this to feel comfortable, like we're at the coffee shop having a cup of coffee. So Emily, I just want to thank you again for joining us, making time to be with us for this chat this afternoon. Do you want to give everybody just a little bit of a background about why you're with Aly Sterling, how you came to be with Aly Sterling, and then we'll kind of jump into a couple questions that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, first of all. I wish we were at a coffee shop enjoying coffee or tea. And I think especially around 2 o'clock, that would be a very nice pick-me-up right now for a lot of us as we're all sort of dozing. But so it's great to be here. Like Jody said, I've been with Aly's firm for just over 3 years now and work with sort of clients across the country, primarily in the fundraising space, but also do a lot of work in this board space, which has been particularly interesting as we sort of navigated this past year, right? So I was super excited talking to Jody yesterday as we were prepping a bit for this, because I'm really excited to hear from all of you what you've been doing and what we're seeing out there, because we've all had these unique challenges, but as the new normal is quickly approaching, right? What are things looking like from a board perspective as we move forward? So I think it's a really great time for this conversation. And like Jody said, you know, I'm sure you guys, a lot of you have been on these before, but your mics are open. So this is just such a great learning opportunity. And yeah, I'm excited to sort of get things kicked off here.
So thanks, Emily. One of the things that has been kind of a buzz right now, as all of you, I'm sure, are trying to navigate as well, is just kind of the social responsibility that we all have as nonprofit leaders in our community around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And time again, a lot of questions are coming at me regarding how should I embrace the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation as it pertains to my board. How are you answering this question, Emily, and what advice would you give to our nonprofits on the call today to kind of breathe into that social responsibility?
Yeah, heavy question, great question, about a million different ways we could answer that question, right? By a nod of heads, do you all struggle somewhat with diversity? Does everyone have questions when it comes to board diversity specifically? Yeah, it's just like this constant thing, right? And I think one of the issues almost with diversity is that in our minds, it's so it's pinpointed to one or two things, right? We think of racial diversity or men versus women, right? Men are overwhelmingly board members and we don't see as many women. But there are so many different facets to diversity that I think we all owe it to our organizations to explore more. I was reading this article few weeks ago, and I took some notes because I thought they were really relevant for today. But it basically was an article about the things that sort of are wrong when it comes to boards and focusing on diversity. And they cited 3 main reasons, which I sort of want to talk through and then get your thoughts on. And the first one was when you pursue diversity, any facet of diversity, over qualifications, right? How many of us look at our board and think, oh my gosh, we have 12 men, no women. And then we go out and find the first women that shows any interest in the organization. And we're like, yeah, come on board. Great. All is good. And we check that box, right? It's sort of that check that box way of thinking, which leads to so many other complications, right? Including tokenism, which we can talk about in a minute, but a huge issue, especially when it comes to racial diversity, right? So that was number 1, that whole putting diversity over qualifications. The second is not valuing differences. So this kind of goes more to that inclusion piece, which I thought was really interesting, because it's great when you have a diverse board, when you bring diversity onto your board. But if you're not listening then to the opinions of those that you've brought onto your board, we have a whole nother issue, right? So boards love cooperation. We love a good agreeable board, don't we? When we can bring an issue to the board and everyone's like, yep, I approve, I second this, we're good. There's not a whole lot of pushback. We talk a lot in our trainings about generative boards. And what we mean when we say a generative board is a board that encourages robust discourse, right? We like challenging opinions. We like differences from different backgrounds. And it can sometimes be really tough for a board to say, yes, we want you to challenge our way of thinking. We want you to push back on this, because that's how we encourage growth. So a lot of times boards can bring on diverse people from different backgrounds, but if they're not actually working to include those different voices, really what are we doing for the organization, right? If we're all just still operating from this place of being agreeable, I'm not sure that there's really a purpose of that diversity then, right? That's the whole piece of this. So that was the second piece. And then the third piece is there's this recognition piece, right? Of saying, we checked the box, we did it. Now tell us we're doing a good job because we have diversity on our board, right? And I don't think that you see that as much in the nonprofit space, but I certainly do think that when you're talking to stakeholders and you need to show people that you are, you're doing the right thing, right? You are going out there and finding new voices for the board. There is that recognition component of saying, I'm doing it. So those were the 3 things that this article cited. And I think, again, we can go in so many different directions, but one of the pieces that stuck out for me in each of them was this concept of social diversity. We talk a lot about racial diversity, gender diversity, even diversity of age, right? We get a lot of boards who struggle with having board members all from a very similar age group, which again, isn't entirely helpful. But then there's also this social diversity, which is diversity of thought, diversity of perception, diversity of background, and how we're attracting people to our organization with those thought processes, because they're not necessarily the people that are our go-tos in our networks and our social circles. How are we finding those people? It can be really tough, right? So Jody, I don't know if you have anything to add into this piece, and I'd love to open it up to the group too, to just hear how are you addressing this? How do you do this? What innovative ways have you found to sort of look for people outside of that norm? Or are we not?
So I was on a call yesterday with Pete, and he said that when you ask a question, you're supposed to remain silent for 11 seconds to allow people the time to process the question and give them time to answer. But I'm going to tell you, 11 seconds on a Zoom call is very uncomfortable, isn't it?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I'm sure there was a study like somewhere saying that. It's probably totally true.
But it's also kind of how many of us on this call are also fundraisers, and the first to speak loses the, so I'm not going to talk first, because as soon as I talk, then I've lost my position, correct?
Yeah.
That's not what we're doing here. I'm not going to ask any of you for money. We're just looking for some casual conversation about how you're breathing into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll tell you one thing. So I am a member of an all-female sorority that is only in the state of Indiana. And we had a recent survey that they sent out. Our leadership from our central office sent out a survey about what our local chapters are doing to add diversity to our sisterhood. Because when you look at our sorority, we are designed to only be female. So, but what other areas can we add diversity into that? What was interesting to me is when the survey went out and all of our sisters received it, the number of sorority sisters that took the survey and were offended by the question was really telling to me. And it's a hard conversation to have, but one thing that I'm doing, and I mentioned this to a board I was helping the other night, who happens to be an all-male vocal group. And we're talking about board development and different things. And I told them about a book that I'm reading. I've taken this as a personal interest to grow myself, because I feel like I am a very inclusive person. But there's a book that is the Covey group shared with me. It's called Leadership to Unconscious Bias. And I have recently read that book. And I will tell you that how we live our lives certainly provide or create unconscious biases within our actions. And that it so speaks to what Emily just said about how and where we're looking for board members. Are we putting ourselves into this tokenism kind of mentality that, okay, as long as I have somebody that is a lawyer on my board, then finally I have my one token lawyer, and then I have to look at other lawyers that actually might provide some really great insight if we had more than one. Or are we only looking for like-minded people to serve on our board, so we have a bunch of yes men on our board and we can just fly through our agenda? What does that do to grow our mission? Those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, and just to add on to that piece really quick about having that token lawyer, I have boards all the time that are board members that come to me and they're like, oh, I need an HR person, or, I need a finance person, I need my whatever. And they're like, we'll throw out names. And my first question is always, okay, but does this person want to do that on your board, right? And that's a whole nother piece of recruiting and for boards. But too often, I think we just make these assumptions about what people want to do when they consider coming onto a board. I can tell you, as somebody who works with fundraising all day, I don't want to go join a board and necessarily be on the fundraising committee. I want to do something completely different that expands different skill sets and different parts of me that I can professionally develop. And I think there's quite a few people like that. And so I've been talking more and more with clients lately who have done a really good job of being more intentional about their recruiting and having important conversations before someone even really gets deep into that recruiting process of coming onto a board. Asking those exploratory questions, making sure that it's really a good fit for both parties. And we're not just trying to say, hey, you checked 2 boxes for us, come on board. Because how many boxes are we checking for them, right? What does that mutually beneficial partnership look like? So again, that was sort of a side note, but I've seen that more and more lately. And sometimes I'm like, gosh, those poor lawyers, they're lawyering all day and then they got to come deal with us at night. And they're probably like, can you give me a break? Like, I would love to just go do something else. Maybe not, but you get that a lot when you have those conversations. Another good proactive best practice when it comes to recruiting new board members, which I feel like a lot of us are doing right now.
One of the things, this is Sean with Bash, one of the things our board has developed and is really trying to work on utilizing is an expertise/leadership matrix that has different categories, and then plotting out who they currently have, and then based on that, trying to look at who they would like to recruit as board members in gap areas, and just move to as a potential board members being presented for the group to say, yeah, go ahead and approach them. The areas that they have expertise in or connections in or whatever that fall within the matrix are listed out so that they make sure they're covering different areas. Because one of the things they found is sometimes you'll have people who are really would be great board members, but you may bring them in when you have an abundance of those people. And so you can shift your board into focusing too much on, say, fundraising or governance or, you know, some of those other areas. And so they're really trying to work on that. And I think that's going to be a key asset as they're moving forward.
Sean, it's almost like you knew what I had next, right? So I want to share with you, Emily and I talking about this yesterday. Board Source has this great strategic board composition matrix available, and it's very similar to what Sean was just referring to, of how you can kind of look at having your board member and answer all of these questions about your board. And it goes down to the qualities that they possess, their personal style. Of course, you have that area of expertise. You know, it does ask the questions that Emily has already talked about that we all look for. That's easy to, that kind of those easy identifiers to diversity, your age, the gender, your sexual orientation, and race. But then you also have community connections. Like, okay, so we have a lot of people from the Concord area, but we don't have anybody from Northridge area or Northwood area. Like, what about, like, especially if you're a youth serving organization and you want to reach out to all of the different school populations, maybe those community connections are key. You fill out this matrix for your board members, but then the step below is then you mark it down and you show how many of your current members do you have in each one of these categories, and if you have prospects there. And so I'd be happy to share this matrix with all of you so that you can see it as a tool to kind of step into that diversity, equity, and equity conversation. So Sean, thank you for leading us right into that.
Happy to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal tool. Thanks for sharing.
Of course.
Well,
So everybody that's registered today, we'll have Liz send a copy of that to you by email.
Okay.
One of the things that we were noticing was that we were shifting, since we were just founded in January, we were shifting our focus to what our main need is at the moment. So even in tonight's board meeting, we are assigning subcommittees and trying to fill those positions. That way we're not overwhelming ourselves in one or two directions, and we can shift our focus everywhere that's needed.
Thanks, Bridget. Kevin, you were going to say something too?
Yeah, I was gonna, we have 6 boards in our organization. So we have a countywide oversight board, which is the 501c3. We have a foundation board, and then we have 4 community boards with about 22 each on that. And there was 2 things I wanted to bring up today. One, not only looking at these these matrices, which are really important for us, but also looking at what we call board voices. There are 4 board voices that and we just did a training for all of our unit boards because we have so many newer board members that have rotated in. And that is the 4 board voices that at least I've heard over my career is visionaries and relationship people who are the ones who have lots of ideas, the relationship person who is just based on everything people return on me. They really want to see consensus. And then there are strategists and truth tellers. And sometimes they tend to have some conflict, but when managed correctly, you need all of those voices. So when we were going through 2008 and going through the pandemic, you could see the strategists and the truth tellers really help us navigate through that. And then as we were going into capital campaign and growth mode, you could see the visionaries and the relationship people really stepping up. So it's just how we navigate with those board voices, which is very important. And then making sure you educate the board so they don't get irritated when the other voice speaks, which tends to happen a lot. And the last thing I was going to say is about intergenerational board development, because we don't talk a lot about that, but it's something that we try to do, where we actually are recruiting the adult children of our senior board members that are rotating off, and their children have grown up basically either in the club or around the club. And then as they graduate from college and start their careers, we have been very, very fortunate to be able to do intergenerational board development. It really helps when you have a strong board governance chair, like I have with Jody. So thank you, Jody, because that's all Jody. So, but those are very key, important things to think about, is the board voices and intergenerational board development, just as much as diversity is, but it's those intangibles you don't really see in board books.
Yep. Thank you, Kevin. I'm happy to stay on this topic, but one of the questions that I'd love to ask Emily for her input on, and maybe it is something that might be on all of your minds, is, there's a lot of talk right now as we continue to get closer to herd immunity with vaccinations, especially with Governor Holcomb's announcement yesterday that the vaccine will be open to all people under or over the age of 16 by March 31st. There's conversation about bringing people back to workplace and going kind of back to life pre-COVID. So, Emily, do you have any advice on how we engage our board as we come out of this pandemic, and anything that COVID has taught us? Like, what do you think?
Yeah. Oof. Gosh, so much, right? Yeah, lots of thoughts. And let me just say really quick, Kevin, I was like scribbling when you were writing. Those were such great things that you were doing that I'm like taking back into my arsenal. So thank you for sharing those. So yeah, oof. This is a big one, right? So it's like the end is near, but is it? I don't know. So we have this Zoom world, right? And I feel like all the articles lately, especially the ones popping up on LinkedIn, are focusing a lot on Zoom fatigue, which I think we're almost in like our second or third round of Zoom fatigue. We've certainly gone in spurts. And there's been Stanford just put out a study, and there's been several others about the emotional intensity required for Zoom meetings that hadn't really previously been discussed as intimately as they had studied and put out in this article, which I thought was interesting. But it essentially was just talking about how when we're on these Zoom calls all day, it is very emotionally taxing, right? We have limited movement. We're staring into other people's homes. We're staring into other people's eyeballs, literally, like we are all looking at each other's faces, which isn't normal for human beings. Our brains go into this like fight or flight mode. And that aside, I think I think there's parts of all of us that love being able to be at home and be with our families and not have to truck across town to go to a board meeting. And then there are other parts of us that wish more than anything we could get out of the house and away from the craziness that is our homes and see people and see other adults sometimes. As someone that works from home and has no human interaction, sometimes I'm like, oh, an adult, I can talk to you. And that's tricky, right? Because what are we going to do? And I think if we polled our boards on, okay, when will you be ready to meet in person again? When will you be ready? Do you ever want to move fully back in person? And really, it's a great conversation to start having with your boards now, if you haven't already. I'm assuming a lot of you have, but about what those expectations are and how we can slowly start that shift, or the mental preparation for that shift back into more normalcy. And I think the main thing that I would say here is that it requires us to sort of recommit ourselves. Right. So this last year has been so, of course, wonky in a million different ways, that all of that structure that we previously had, that consistency that we relied on, has been gone for so long. So how are we recommitting ourselves to our practices as board members, as ambassadors and stewards of this organization, and what are those promises that we're going to make to each other moving forward, right? So my team is big fans of what we call team norms, which is truly just the commitments we make to how we're treating one another. And it's a great time to sort of start doing that with your boards again, is having these conversations around, what do we want our interactions to look like moving forward? Do we want to make seeing each other in person a priority, even if it's only once a quarter or every other month? How can we make this hybrid model work? And how can we listen to everyone's thoughts and opinions on it? Because this is such a personal space and people have such strong feelings on their comfort levels with going back to in person versus, being on Zoom. And how are we flexible with that? Because if you do choose to meet in person, which I have lots of clients right now who are sort of planning their summer retreat, June, July-ish, as their first in person, which, we'll change it if needed, but that's sort of okay, we have 3 months to see how things go. But how are you really making people feel comfortable with that? And some won't be. And so how are we making that work too for the organization? So yeah, I would love to, like Jody said, open it up to your thoughts on how you guys are approaching this. Have you had these conversations yet? Are you, does your board, have you experienced a more engaged board virtually, or are you sensing they're sort of ready to be back in person?
And I'd love to add the question, and then we're going to do 11 seconds, right?
I was going to say, I'm going to just sit here for 11 seconds.
I'd love to also hear any feedback of what all of you have learned. What has COVID taught you about your boards as you think about emerging out of the pandemic?
This is Blake Andres. I'm Director of Development and Planning with the Community Health Clinic in Topeka. And actually, I split my time between Ohio, where my home is, and Topeka, where I had done similar work for 8 years. I'll share 2 recent examples and observations that happened in the same day. The Community Health Clinic serves kids with rare genetic disorders and does a lot of great work throughout Indiana. Probably 75 to 80% of the population we serve is Amish. And our board is probably about 65 to 70% Amish, and they have been very eager to all be together. Of course, it's a very big part of the, it's the social structure of the community. The decisions are made by groups, and it's been very, very difficult for them to have folks split. Although I got to say they've been very accommodating with the other half of the board on Zoom. In our staff meetings, because we do medicine, we have A/B teams in the clinic in order to prevent people from cross-fertilizing one another. And the Zoom meetings have been very, very productive and very, very well done. On a volunteer role where I sit on a regional hospital board, and I got online the other night, I downloaded the 177-page board packet from BoardVantage. And when I did the count, I make it just recently, I've made maybe 2 of the last 3 hospital board meetings. There were 16 people online, and 8 of those 16 just had their name or a still picture. And there were roughly 12 senior executive staff from the hospital board in the room, and maybe 3 or 4 board members. And I can say, despite the best intentions, momentum has been lost. The level of engagement has been lost. Obviously, folks are really busy, but when half of the folks on those Zoom meetings don't even have their window open and their picture there, there's not much level of engagement. And then we have probably backtracked significantly from moving back towards 85, 90% staff reporting and maybe 5 to 15% of actual engagement with the board members. Very, very little time actually to ask those BHAGs, those big, hairy, audacious goals and questions, nowhere near the level of engagement. And that's not a fault probably of just the technology. I think it's probably a fault of the expectations for how you would participate via Zoom, for example, versus those same kinds of things would not have happened in the same way if everybody was sitting in the room. So again, I've seen the advantages and disadvantages. Certainly in my work role, the community is very, very eager. And if anything, because we deal with medically fragile kids, we have really had to hold back But in some of my volunteer work on a couple of other boards, I've seen significant underuse of board members.
You know, Blake, I'm gonna share an article in the chat thread, and I'll ask Liz to send it out to everybody when we send out the board matrix as well. That I just actually received from the Society of Human Resource Management, SHRM, that talked about whether or not we should be, as employers, mandating vaccinations before we return to work. And one of the key points in this article spoke to the culture of your organization. And what does your culture of the organization tell you you should do? And I think for you, your decisions are very culturally aligned to like what works for you and where can you be most engaging. And so I really appreciate that insight that you shared, because if we don't think about the populations we're serving and the culture we've created for our organization, and we make decisions without that in mind, there's going to be a disconnect, right? So I'll put the article in the chat, but I'll also ask Liz to share that post the chat here today.
I appreciate that. And at the risk of taking too much air out of the virtual room here, I'll put out a general request, should we even have time to take this on before this coffee talk is up. And I'd love to hear others' feelings. Obviously, Zoom has made this perhaps a little more of a challenge, but separate from Zoom and COVID, I'd love to hear a little bit of dialogue around meaningful engagement with board members, and something very operational that I'm assuming at various points in all our careers we've struggled with is a sort of committee structures and real engagement with board members. I've been in boards with, 2 or 3 committees that have worked really well. I've been on boards with 12 committees where the administrative suite spends 50% of their time just managing the committees, and before long, you've realized that you've saddled them with a whole lot of busy work and they're not feeling so engaged. So it's probably almost an entirely separate subject, but it'd be wonderful to hear others' succinct thoughts in a little bit of time that we have.
Sure, and I will just note that it is 2:30. We allot time for our coffee talks until 2:30, but I always block it for an hour. And so as long as people would like to stay and have the conversation, I'm happy to keep the Zoom room open and let's keep talking. I think, Blake, you bring up a good point of some needs that you have, and I'd love to step into that space. If anybody else has any comments about re-engaging your board or what COVID has taught you about Zoom.
I just wanted to respond to Blake. I turned my camera on as a result of his comment about people having their camera off. We do a lot of Zoom meetings during the day. I'm sure all of you do too. And I don't have a very attractive office. Those fake backdrops make your head look like it's blown off in the back. And I was fully listening to everything everyone was saying. I was not like in the other room filing or anything. I just, I hear what you're saying. And I think get tired of worrying. Did I put makeup on this morning? What kind of shirt do I have? Did I remember to wear my name tag? So there are times when it does feel like we've had enough of worrying about what this looks like and not having the pretty furniture behind me. So message received though, Blake.
I was going to add, this is Debbie Smoger. I just became chair of the board for the YWCA of North Central Indiana as of January 1st. So it's the first board I've ever served on, and I've been on the board for about 3.5 years. First board, of course, that I've ever chaired. So I started with having one-on-ones with the CEO, executive director. So in a way, it was a blessing that we had the pandemic, because it really forced everyone to become familiar with the technology, and everyone can have Zoom. And we just did 15-minute one-on-ones. And I just finished reading the book by Brian Grazer called Curious Mind. And he's a movie producer, and he's done all these curiosity conversations. So I kind of just looked at it as curiosity conversations, and try to gauge where my board members are, and, you know, really look at what our mission is. And it's really hard because things aren't normal right now, especially when you run a building where women and children are living, and, you know, they may have to be quarantined and things like that. So to me, it was a nice way to connect with everyone one-on-one, although we've been doing board meetings via Zoom. It really gave them, I think, a sense of being able to really tell us how they feel. So I think that worked and everyone appreciated it. We have 17 board members and we were able to successfully meet with 15 out of the 17. I'm not giving up on the other two, but so I don't know if that helps.
That is such a wonderful practice. So that's one of the things I always tell people I work with is if you can do this on an annual basis, even better, right? Because it's quick. It didn't take up a whole lot of your time, hopefully, but I feel like they, board members then feel empowered to be candid and to give you true feedback on, okay, I haven't been engaged, but it's because I've had this, this, and this going on and life's been crazy, right? Sorry, my cat's like, talk about Zoom as my, like, one cat's here, one's like clawing at my leg. I swear. But incredible best practice. We've been encouraging what we call compassion calls that are truly just that. They're a check-in to see how people are doing, see if we can get help in any way, but just to sort of meet people where they're at. And I think that's a really good thing for board members, just to feel like you're still a part of this team. I get it. If you are going through something or if you feel engaged and like you want to take on more, either way, let's just talk about it. So I think that's just wonderful. I wanted to give you kudos for that.
Yeah. And as far as the topic of, you know, Zoom or back in person, I work for a company where we've been mandated to work from home, which, you know, is not what I want. So I am ready to get back to the office and, you know, out. Today I happen to be working in a remote office. Don't tell anybody. But I think from a nonprofit and busy, you know, I have a full-time job. I'm very busy, and busy people get things done. And I think a lot of our board members, you know, are busy. Most of them are. So I think it's nice to be able to have the option for the technology of a virtual meeting. But there certain serendipity happens too when you're in person. Our board meetings are already just every other month, so we don't meet a lot as it is, but we're trying to plan for a retreat for our board in August. And that would be the first time that we'll be getting together in person for over a year and a half at that point. But I think people will feel safer to do it that way too. So I think it's a mixed bag, you know, what you like. And I think if we can make it a hybrid, you know, so we are in person, but if we have the technology, can we also have people join virtually if possible? Because I'd rather have that than nothing at all, you know, just what we're thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the comment that Sean put in the chat. I hope that you guys all had an opportunity to read that, where, you know, one of the board members kind of said, like, let's read our mission, visions, and statements and say, where in there does it say, unless we're in a pandemic? What a great kind of reminder of why we are in the nonprofit sector. Our work doesn't stop just because a pandemic hit us. And I'm sure that many of you will attest to the fact that in many ways, the populations that you serve need you more now more than ever. And to be able to give that space and further kind of cement the impact of your mission to your board, all that does is help build board capacity and passion for stronger leaders and ambassadors for your mission.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
I've been really proud of our board members. I really have been. This has been hard on their businesses, their families, their health. Many of them are taking care of their parents, their grandchildren, and yet they have walked right alongside our nonprofit and have been in the moment every time I've needed them. They're always right there, whether it's a phone call or text. Sometimes they reach out to see how I'm doing, and I'm trying to reach out to see how they're doing. So I just think that speaks to a healthy organization where the emotional deposits and are still very strong. So we're not just withdrawing from the bank, but we keep adding to it. So sometimes you don't know how good your board is until they're tested. And I think we've all, we know who the ones who are strong and are resilient. And I just feel really blessed to be able to have such strong, resilient board members. Really, I do.
And Jim put in the comments, which I think is a interesting thought too, is that it can be really tricky, I think, and we might figure this out as we go along more, to have an in-person, but also have people on Zoom while others are meeting in person, because that's a whole nother interesting dynamic. It's one thing if one board meeting's all of us on Zoom, the next is all in person, but I think for quite a while, we'll have to sort of just offer, even when we're back in person and feeling good, there will still be some people who feel more comfortable. How do we engage those people? That's tricky.
And the technology around it really is not the best. I mean,
No.
the Community Foundation has invested some significant resources to provide some technology that will be available for public consumption at the Commons, at the Aquatic Center, and trying to come up with good usage of both in-person and that hybrid virtual option, and getting the two to mix. It really does go back to the days of conference calls where the person that's on the conference call, you don't know what they're doing. They're trying to kind of interrupt, and by the time they get in, that point is already missed. And so we've done this before. It's just now we can see people's faces, and it's just a matter of kind of offering that grace and space, right?
I was going to say that as well. I'm Julia Gauchi, and I'm the chair of the board at Goshen Theater in downtown Goshen. And I've been the chair since January 1st and been on the board a number of years. But I find, and we're doing all of our boards virtual now, and we'll probably continue virtually on Zoom until we can gather without masks, because we have some people with hearing difficulties, and actually Zoom is much easier for those people. And they can put headphones on, they can hear a little bit easier, and of course they can see faces without masks. And so I think we'll continue to do that until we can meet without masks. But I find it very difficult to do a hybrid. Another board I'm on, we've done hybrid. And the technology needs to be so good. You need to have a really good microphone so everyone can hear. I think you have to have a big screen so that the people, can see each other. Well, I think it's complicated. It's much easier to either do it in person or to do Zoom, but we'll probably have to figure that out. But one of the advantages with my board at the theater, with virtual, with Zoom, is that a number of them go to Florida for the winter, and everyone has been able to connect even though they're gone. And so I think we will probably, in the winter time, we might continue to do Zoom, and in the summer, that's something that I plan to talk with the board about. And then in the summer, meet together once we can. But we've had much better attendance with Zoom for people who are out of town and can still attend.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I count that as a COVID win. That's what we call it in my space. So I want to go all the way back up, and maybe this might touch a little bit onto Blake's comment about structuring committees, but Brian Baylor put a really neat comment in the chat about board recruitment and filling kind of where we are with recruiting good board members. I will say that, Emily and I were talking about this too, is oftentimes we get questions of, where do we find good quality board members? All of the board members are taken by somebody else, and there's only so many people that can serve on the board. And I don't know if you guys saw Brian's chat message earlier that, they serve a group of students, and they basically took the demographics of those students and said, okay, here are where all of our students are coming from. Do we have a board member that represents that area? And so Brian, I just wanted to say thank you for posting that. I saw it, I read it, and I wanted to just make sure we called that out as an opportunity for all of you when you're looking for board, where do you find a board member, to think about the population you're serving, and does your board represent who you're serving? That's a great best practice, and kudos to you, Brian, for recognizing that and using it as a recruitment tool.
And
I
can I
yeah,
hop on
please.
that really quick? Because kind of bringing both those two questions together, I know of an organization where I am at, it's a high school, that they just added 3 new board members, none of whom are located in the same city as us, which before would have been, they would not have even ever in any world been considered because they weren't in town, right? And there was just no way that would have worked. And now, like, the possibilities are endless. I mean, it truly is amazing that you can go find board members anywhere in the country. I mean, yeah, that might be like a little bit of a stretch, but at the same time, like, so many of those parameters now are gone in a lot of ways, because you can find these rock stars. You can get diversity of so many different things, right? When you can look further, because I know we all, our communities seem so finite when it comes to this pool of really skilled board members. And in some ways it can be, right? We want the people who know what they're doing. But now that we can look outside of that, because we have technology and we know how to use it, and we know what to look for from a diversity perspective that's unique and not necessarily the way that we've always had to think. Wow, it seems like those possibilities are so great.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left here, if we stretch into the full hour. And I appreciate all of you guys hanging out with us for a little past our 30 minutes. I think that we're having some really good dialogue. Let's step into Blake's question here for a second. If you will all stick with us, and then feel free, again, if you have things on your calendar that you need to drop off, we will not be offended by that. Blake, talk to us a little bit more about where you're feeling this struggle with structures and committees.
So probably 4 or 5 years ago, finishing up a year-long fellowship, I had a wonderful faculty person from La Piana who came in and was taking a look at the organization I was affiliated at the time, who had one of the larger boards in metropolitan Cleveland, at 75, 80 people because of mergers and acquisitions and things. And we had about a dozen different committees, and the facilitator made a really strong case that many nonprofits, especially smaller ones, which I'm assuming a few of us are represented here today, could probably pretty easily go to a 2 or 3 committee board, sort of the internal affairs, external affairs, and either your full board, and that so many of those other committees really weren't necessary for small nonprofits if you were doing this right, because you create all these committees, you have a lot of overlap with some of the same folks. If you have a small board, you're spending a whole lot of time trying to meaningfully engage those folks. And we are probably a lot better off reducing those total number of boards to something that was much more manageable, leaning more heavily towards ad hoc committees, so that people had a limited time, and it would be a lot easier to recruit good people to participate on an ad hoc committee than it would be for a standing long-term committee, and to not be afraid to either pause, put to sleep, or eliminate some long-standing committees. And so I took some of that advice in the larger organization we all felt pretty good about, that we were never able to implement. And I've had, in the last 10 years, probably 2 failed efforts of trying to generate any board interest in going that direction. But it made a whole lot of sense to me on the surface, in terms of having fewer committees with very meaningful work, much more engagement, it was quality over quantity. And for a lot of folks, like at the last 2 nonprofits I've been involved with about 15 to 20 board members, in my head, I could see how that would work, but I didn't have a whole lot of luck in making a credible argument with the board themselves. And I'm curious if there's anybody on this call who has found themselves with perhaps too many committees to manage, and if they've successfully pared back and gave folks more meaningful engagement.
So I actually set a timer for 11 seconds, and that's what it feels like, by the way. Emily, do you have, I know that you and the Aly Sterling Philanthropy Group really does talk about the different types of boards that you have, from strategic to the generative to the fiduciary. That's kind of what I was thinking about when Blake was talking. And here's what I will say. I say this often. You have to have a board makeup that fits your work and your organization. There is not a one size fits all. Just because Kevin has dropped off, and I know for a fact because I help him lead his board governance, because he has 106 board members, doesn't mean that everybody needs to have 106 board members. Somebody might have a board that has 4 or 5 board members, and they are rocking it out and like gangbusters, right? But for Kevin, he has 6 different, basically these committees or club boards that serve a very specific purpose. And so because of that, when recruiting board members for those different purposes, the makeup of those individuals are different. And I will say one more thing, Blake. Kudos to you for shrinking down the people, because and I have had this conversation with Brian as well. Brian, I don't mean to call you out, but, and I know it's something that he's really nervous about. When you have the same people not only providing the parent support to your clients, or the volunteering support, and being a board member, you're going to risk burnout. And then it becomes a life sentence, right? And people aren't going to step up to volunteer because, my gosh, Jody's been on that board for 25 years. I don't want to have that, collar around my neck. I want a short board service. And if you don't demonstrate that, then you're less likely to recruit new people to your board. And again, providing space for your board members to enjoy maybe the volunteering piece, but then stepping back and not having to worry about that strategic implementation piece. And for you to be able to recognize, Blake, that there's a difference between that committee work that might be more short-term and some long-term board governance for your organization, I think is really, really healthy.
Thanks.
Yeah, Blake, all the things you're saying, it's funny, I was taking down notes as you were talking, and then everything you were saying, I was like, oh, you covered that. I mean, all of your thoughts are completely right, and that your committee needs to have meaningful work. It needs to be tied into the overall strategic plan. They need to have a plan. They need to all be bought into the plan, right? And that in itself can be really difficult. And then there's the accountability piece, right? How are we keeping our boards or our committees accountable and helping them move forward instead of stagnate, which so many do. And that can be really tough. And so, like Jody mentioned, I'm not sure it's as much about the number of committees, although I tend to go on the smaller side, because you're right. I mean, when there's too many, it's hard to really keep that accountability in check. But if each of your committees was highly functioning, have as many as you want, really, as long as they're really beneficial. But you really need to make sure all those committee members are bought into the same vision. They're all moving in the same direction, just like on the board, and that they have work that they're excited about and that they want to move forward. And you're right, those standing committees sometimes can get old, right? It's burnout, we're tired. And so I love the sort of, at the beginning of every year, we evaluate every single committee and determine if right now that's the right thing for our organization. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it lets everyone on the committee sort of know there's a time frame. I know there's an end in sight. I know that we'll reevaluate to make sure we're still working towards the right things. So I know it's a whole other conversation. These things. I know it's a whole different thing to get your board to understand that too, but hopefully it helps it helps you know that you're moving in the right direction, at least with making sure there's at least meaningful work to be done and that they are all bought in around that direction.
One other terminology that I've tried to use to kind of spice things up here real quick, instead of calling something a standing committee or an ad hoc committee, I recently learned a few months ago about a terminology called a tiger team. And people, I mean, tiger teams are something that, and I'm going to put this in the chat here, that Apollo 13 used in 1970. And it really is a specialized cross-functional team that is put together to solve a specific thing. And even just to change it up a little bit and make things exciting, to say, hey, I'm going to put a tiger team together. This is your function. Here's your mission. Go forth. And how would that change your board engagement if they could be a part of a tiger team instead of an ad hoc committee kind of thing? I mean, it's the semantics things, right? We're salespeople. We got to sell it. So
that's a great suggestion. I like that a lot. Yeah.
It's a more dynamic expression for a task force.
Yeah.
But a task force has that same sort of, we're going to solve this problem and then we're done. I've been stuck in a sort of in-between phase for a board when I was at a young museum that was still transitioning from being a founding board to an operating board to a policy board. And some functions of the museum operation had different feet in different camps, so we had moved to a policy board in some ways, but not necessarily in other ways. So getting the board to comfortably delegate operations to the staff and still have work for them to do that was meaningful, but transitioned them out of having to feel that they had to run the place was a big challenge, because they'd been so used to being in charge of everything and they didn't have to be anymore. But it was a newer organization, so there were people on the board still who had founded the organization, and they were used to this role and not the trust that comes with being a policy board and delegating those staff operations to staff. So that's a challenging place to be, and maybe different for arts and cultural entities than for social services entities, but probably not so much.
Well, gang, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I including my next appointment at 3 o'clock. And so I really do appreciate the engaging conversation we've had here, and the different questions. I opened up the meeting, or our casual coffee talk this afternoon, to say, if there are any topics that you would like to dig into deeper, please let us know. We want to make sure that we're providing all of you meaningful insights to help you advance your work and your mission. Emily, thank you for taking time with us today. I hope you enjoyed the coffee chat, and appreciate the work that you do with Aly Sterling Philanthropy, not only in the communities in the nonprofits you serve, but really right here in Elkhart County. It really does feel like you're here all the time for us, and I really do appreciate our partnership. Thank you for taking time and offering your expertise into this area. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Email us, let us know if you need us. Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.